Oki, and welcome to Lethbridge School Division's presentation for the 2022-2023 budget. My name is Avis DeKelver, and I'm the Director of Finance at Lethbridge School Division. I'm excited to walk you through the division's budget process. We will go over the following: the funding the division receives, how it is allocated, and how it is spent. At the end of the presentation, there will be information on how the public can provide feedback for the 2022-2023 budget. First, I would like to begin this presentation by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Treaty 7 First Nations. We acknowledge that many First Nations peoples whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and pay respect to the land that we all live, work, and play. So how did we get to today? The budget process has many steps and pieces to its success. It all starts in January with gathering information for enrollment estimates. February has the Division Town Hall, where community engagement is gathered, as well as the release of the provincial budget, which gives the division its funding framework. March has meetings with both the Board of Trustees and Instructional Budget Committee to establish priorities that will be incorporated into the budget. April has school administrators and department heads allocating their expenditures in their individual budgets. May has presentations to both the Board of Trustees as well as this public presentation to ensure the division is meeting the May 31st deadline established by Alberta Education for budget submission. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and I would like to express my thanks and gratitude for everyone's cooperation and input as we move throughout this process to ensure funds are being best allocated to support student needs. The division's town hall was held virtually in February of 2022 and had over 280 participants answering 2 questions. The first, in what ways have we successfully supported student learning? And the second, moving forward, what can the school division do to strengthen support of student learning? Answers were gathered, categorized, and 7 themes emerged: inclusion through diversity, learning and supports, online instruction, continue to be flexible and responsive to student needs, student supports, staff supports, wellness, and health standards and secure schools. These themes helped the Board of Trustees develop their board strategic priorities for the 22-23 school year, which included teaching and leading through achievement, inclusion, and innovation, which is addressed through the following: the use of student assessments, reporting and informing parents regarding these assessments, recruitment and retention of diverse staff, and professional learning for UDL, literacy, and numeracy. Learning supports, which is addressed through the following: adaptation of learning environment, including UDL, specialists, and educational assistants, wellness with emphasis on universal strategies, health curriculum and career planning, and early education programs. Lastly, achievement, which is addressed through the following: literacy, numeracy, experiential learning through careers, off-campus learning, outdoor learning and thinking classrooms, online learning, and investment in fundamentals and socialization in K-3. As well as these priorities, the Board of Trustees developed specific beliefs in regards to the budget, which are the following: that the budget is developed in the best interest of the students, that the budget process be open and transparent, that the budget will provide staffing to facilitate educational opportunities for all students, that education, especially at the primary level, is foundational to student success. Funds are to be allocated to promote access to educational opportunities and resources for all students, to keep division fees as low as possible, to maintain an uncommitted reserve for emergent and contingent situations, allocating funds to specific centralized programs and services to increase opportunities for student learning, and to provide targeted opportunities to further innovate practices in schools. These beliefs, along with the priorities, guide the budget decisions made for the 22-23 school year. Now we will discuss how the budget is funded. Student enrollment is the most significant factor in determining the division's funding. For the 22-23 school year, it is estimated that total enrollment will be 11,813 students, which is a 1.23% or 143 student increase from the 21-22 school year. Elementary and high school are estimated to grow, while early education, kindergarten, and middle schools are estimated to have slight reductions. The division continues to see enrollment recover after experiencing reductions in the last 2 school years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The division is funded on a weighted moving average framework. How this is calculated is as follows. 20% of the actual full-time equivalent, or FTE, from the 2020-2021 school year. 30% of the estimated FTE from the 21-22 school year, and 50% from the projected FTE from the 22-23 school year. Please note that early education and kindergarten are 0.5 FTE for this calculation. This calculation determines that 11,058 is the division's WMA enrollment for the 22-23 school year. As you can see, 11,058 is under the 11,287 projected for the 22-23 school year. This means that due to the weighted moving average framework, the division will serve 229 FTE more than it will receive funding for in 22-23. So while enrollment continues to grow and is estimated to continue to grow in the next few years, the effects of the WMA will have an impact on the division's funding, which then will lead us into discussing the division's revenues. Revenue for the 2022-2023 school year is projected to be $135.96 million, which is an overall increase from the 21-22 budget of 1.44%. 91.4% of revenue is coming from the provincial government in the form of a variety of grants, with the remaining amounts coming from the federal government, fees, fundraising, and donations, also known as school-generated funds, and other, mainly reserves. The main changes from the 21-22 budget include the following: a 1% increase in the base grant rate. Please note that the base grant rate is 55% of the division's total revenue. A 1% increase in plant operations and maintenance grant rate. A 4.6% increase in transportation grant rate. $2.1 million in COVID mitigation funding, and $3.4 million in bridge or hold harmless funding. It is important to note that these two areas are not anticipated to continue into the future and could be reduced or eliminated in future years. $2.5 million is estimated for school-generated funds due to activities returning to the school level with lessening public health restrictions. These include field trips, extracurricular activities, and additional option courses. Lastly, the division has allocated the use of $2.54 million in one-time reserve funding to assist in funding areas identified through the board and instructional budget committee priorities. Continuing with revenue for the 22-23 school year, it is an overall $1.9 million increase from 21-22. Within this chart, it is showing a breakdown of all the funding sources within the division. Base instruction is the enrollment from K to 12. Within this section is also the bridge and COVID mitigation funding. Services and support include funding for student wellness, pre-K, ESL, refugee and Indigenous programming, among others. Schools and facilities include plant operations and maintenance, transportation, and IMR funding, which stands for infrastructure, maintenance, and renewal. Community includes socioeconomic, geographical, and school nutrition grants. Jurisdiction includes funding for system administration costs. Included in the prior year one-time funding were grants for the Learning Disruption Grant, known in the division as BOOST, of $439,000, and $25,000 in grant funding for the French Immersion Program at Ecole Agnes Davidson. Other provincial revenues include the Making Connections programming through AHS and the Alberta School Council Engagement Grant. Teacher pension costs are paid to the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund, and federal government funding is funding received from the Kainai Board of Education for students attending Lethbridge School Division. Other revenues include school-generated funds, which are the donations, fundraising, and fees, international students, early education programs, and interest income on short-term, low-risk investments such as GICs. And then lastly, capital and debt services includes amortization. Again, to note that this budget contains $2.5 million of one-time reserves. This funding is being used to help with cost pressures, as well as Alberta Education has put a limit on the amount of reserves school divisions can now carry. The cap on reserves comes into effect at the end of the next operating year, August 31st, 2023, and the division must be down to 3.15%, or any excess reserves will be clawed back by Alberta Education. Reserves are only ever accurately known at year end, so the division will review the reserves when the August 31st, 2022 year end is being finalized, and any adjustments needed to be added to the fall operating budget will be done in November of 2022. So how does all this funding get allocated into expenditures? Well, as expected, expenditures for the 22-23 school year equal $135.96 million, which is a 1.44% increase from the prior year. Staffing is 77% of the division's total budget, and Lethbridge School Division is the city's fourth largest employer in 2022. The main changes from 21-22 budget include a 2.1% increase in certificated staffing, teachers, due to increased cost of benefits and grid movements, as well as a 4.5 additional FTE for the 22-23 school year. A 1.54% decrease in uncertificated staffing from decreased enrollment within early education programs has decreased educational assistance, mainly within the program unit funding, also known as PUF or severe kindergarten. A 7.2% decrease in contracted and general services due to allocating funds to other areas experiencing inflationary cost pressures, as well as an overall reduction in funding in the plant operations and maintenance budget. A 12.72% increase in supplies, which is mainly due to the $2.5 million increase of school-generated fund activities. This offsets the increase in revenues as these fees are collected specifically for certain activities. A 7.9% increase in utilities due to administrative costs, mainly carbon tax, and a 2.3% increase in capital and debt services due to additional costs associated with the new accounting standard being implemented. So just a little bit of additional information on staffing. So 56% of the total budget is certificated staffing or teachers. 21% of the budget is uncertificated staff or support. Teaching staff is going to increase for the 22-23 school year by 4.5 FTE. These FTE are currently in a contingency allocation and will be allocated in the fall to address any hotspots that may arise once final enrollment numbers are known. Support staff overall has seen a decrease of 8.7 FTE. The main reason for this is due to decreased enrollment in the pre-K and kindergarten programs, such as program unit funding or PUF and severe kindergarten programs. Less specific funding was received from Alberta Education, therefore resulting in less educational assistants being hired for this program. This chart shows the staffing growth compared to enrollment growth over the last 5 years. As you can see, staffing has been able to remain relatively consistent even with fluctuations in enrollment, meaning fluctuations in funding. This is due to receiving one-time funding in the form of bridge and COVID mitigation, as well as one-time reserves used to ensure staffing remained stable. We will now dive a little deeper into the expenditures and look at each program. Programs include instruction, administration, plant operations and maintenance, transportation, and capital and debt services. 82% of the division's budget is spent on instructional services for students, and the remaining 18% is spent on non-instructional support services. As part of the budget process, an instructional budget committee is utilized to allocate the funding throughout the instructional programs. The IBC includes executive council as well as administrative representatives from elementary, middle, and high schools. These representatives meet with their colleagues to determine where the biggest needs are within their school level and relay that information to the instructional budget committee. The recommendations put forth by the instructional budget committee included funding for counseling, particularly at the middle and high school levels through the use of one-time reserves, maintaining class size at elementary through the use of COVID mitigation funding, returning to a previous model of lead teachers and split the literacy and ESL lead teacher role to better support initiatives. The priorities of the board and of the instructional budget committee guide budgetary decisions. Total expenditures in instruction for 22-23 are $111 million. There is a 1.94% increase from the prior year. Let's break that down to each program within instruction. So under elementary, the enrollment has increased by 40 students in K-5. Elementary is able to maintain its funding through $1.4 million in COVID mitigation funding. Certificated staff are decreasing by 4.2 FTE, which are being allocated to other programs. Uncertificated staff is mainly decreasing due to a $25,000 reduction from the Odyssey French language grant that was the one-time grant received in 21-22. Supplies have decreased for furniture and equipment due to one-time reserve funding being used in the prior year for larger purchases. Middle school enrollment is decreasing by 24 students in grades 6 to 8. Certificated staff decreased by 2.6 FTE, which are now being allocated to other programs. Uncertificated staff is decreasing as student support workers in the prior year were partially funded by the middle schools themselves. For the 22-23 school year, the funding is now coming through counseling as part of the use of one-time reserves to address recommendations put forth by the Instructional Budget Committee. Supplies have decreased for furniture and equipment due to one-time reserve funding being used in the prior year for larger purchases. High school enrollment is increasing by 130 students in grades 9 to 12. Certificated staff is increasing by 3.4 to address enrollment growth. Uncertificated staff decreases as funding for the family school liaison counselors and student support workers will now be funded through counseling for the 22-23 school year as part of the use of one-time reserves to address recommendations put forth by the Instructional Budget Committee. Supplies have decreased for furniture and equipment due to the one-time reserve funding being used in the prior year for larger purchases. Other instructional programs include inclusive learning, technology, and other, and we will go through those ones as well. So within inclusive learning, there was an overall reduction of 11.3 FTE of educational assistance with the decrease in program unit funding or PUF and severe kindergarten enrollment and therefore funding. These decreases are offset by increases in the Making Connections staff and due to increased funding, and then additional family support liaisons and student support workers as discussed above through funding. These came through one-time reserves through counseling. Technology changes from the prior year include slight increases to computer supplies and software to keep up with demands and changing needs. There's also a $900,000 capital transfer to the Technology Evergreen Capital Reserve to help fund upgrades to technology in the future. And lastly, other instructional program changes from the prior year include an increase in certificated staff, mainly from the 4 FTE contingent staff allocated here until the fall once hotspots can be addressed when enrollment figures are finalized. And supplies have increased due to the increase of the $2.5 million in school-generated fund activities to offset the revenues. Overall, 82% of the division's total budget is spent on instructional activities. Throughout the budget process, the board's and Instructional Budget Committee priorities are in the forefront and are ensured that they are met. The board's priorities included teaching and leading. This is being met through a $100,000 allocation to Fontes and Pinnell testing. In prior years, this had been funded through one-time reserves. However, now that it is a long-term initiative by the division, it is now funded through operating. Professional learning is a priority and will continue to be funded through instruction. Additional funding for new curriculum implementation was announced by the provincial government in February 2022, and the division is awaiting additional information as to how this funding is to be spent and how much specifically Lethbridge School Division will receive. Learning supports are addressed through the returning up to the original model for lead teachers by separating the ESL and literacy lead teacher, as well as funding the lead teacher through operating funds rather than reserves, as they are now long-term initiatives by the division. Early education focus continues to be supported through program allocations and additional funding through the COVID mitigation that the division received for the 22-23 school year, even with the significant decreases in enrollment. Achievement is supported by prioritizing class size at K-3 by allocating $1.4 million of COVID mitigation funding to maintain class sizes. As well as $129,500 has been allocated to the dual credit program at the high school level. This program is now also funded through operating funds rather than one-time reserves, and it is now a long-term initiative of the division. The Instructional Budget Committee priorities included, at the elementary level, maintaining class sizes, particularly in the lower levels, which will be addressed by allocating $1.4 million in COVID mitigation funding. At the middle school level, counseling and supports are now being funded through one-time reserves as opposed to at the middle school level. And at the high school level, additional counseling supports are being added through the use of one-time reserve funds. At the administration level, wellness supports as well as maintaining lead teachers. This has been addressed through the returning to the original model of separating the ESL lead teacher and the literacy lead teacher and are now included within the operating budget. Additional wellness supports were announced within the provincial budget in February. However, additional information has yet to be received. Once the division receives information on how much funding it will receive and how it can be allocated, it will be incorporated into the budget to address wellness areas in highest need of support. Expenditures within administration total $4.1 million for 22-23. This amount has remained the same from the prior year. Administration covers many of the legislative and operational requirements of the division and includes the cost of the following departments: Office of the Superintendent, Business and Finance, Human Resources, System Instructional Support, and the Board of Trustees. Staffing remained the same in these departments from the prior year. Contracted and general services saw an increase due to higher insurance premiums, which has been offset by a decrease in supplies for the 22-23 school year. 3% of the division's total budget is spent on administration activities. Expenditures within plant operations and maintenance total $10.3 million for the 22-23 school year, a decrease of 4.6% from the prior year. Plant operations and maintenance covers the division's responsibilities for the construction, operation, maintenance, safety, and security of all buildings and includes the cost of maintenance, caretaking, and any capital-related costs within the division. There is a 1% increase in the plant operations and maintenance grant. However, due to the grant reduction in 21-22 that was held harmless with COVID funding in 21-22, the effect of this reduction is now realized in 22-23 as there is less COVID funding available to be allocated for 22-23. Decreases in contracted and general services, mainly decreases within building maintenance costs, are offset by increases in utilities and insurance premiums. As well, $220,000 from plant operation maintenance reserves are being used in the 22-23 budget to help with increased cost pressures due to inflation. 8% of the division's total budget is spent on plant operations and maintenance activities. Expenditures within transportation total $3.1 million for 22-23, an increase of 4.6% from the prior year. Transportation includes all activities of transporting students to, from, and between schools. The division transports over 3,900 students daily. The increase in the transportation grant of 4.6% helps cover the increase in busing contract for the 22-23 school year. However, $200,000 from the transportation reserves are also being used to help with increased cost pressures due to the increased cost of fuel. 2% of the division's total budget is spent on transportation activities. Expenditures in capital and debt services total $7.3 million for the 22-23 school year for an increase of 2.4%. Within this program are amortization expenses, as well as a new accretion expense due to a new accounting standard, asset retirement obligations being implemented for the 22-23 school year. Even as an accountant, I will not bore you with the details of AROs, but just note that going forward, they will be included in the division's financials to comply with public sector accounting standards. As well within this area is the infrastructure maintenance and renewal, or IMR, costs associated with the funding received for the 22-23 school year. 5% of the division's budget is spent on capital and debt services. As I draw this presentation to a close, I want to thank you for your attention and participation. If you are wanting to know more, please visit our website where the preliminary budget executive summary, as well as the 22-23 budget infographics are posted. As part of the budget process, we are looking for public feedback. There is a quick online survey that includes both a rating of the budget as well as a section to include any comments you may have about the 2022-2023 budget. This feedback survey is available from Tuesday, May 17th and will close Monday, May 23rd. The feedback will then be provided to the Board of Trustees as part of their board budget debate on Wednesday, May 25th. Thank you again for your interest in the division's budget process, and we look forward to hearing your feedback.